The HOA decided to penalize him for having too many cars in front of the house, but didn't know who he really was. What happened next, no one expected. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. Darius Williams had always dreamed of owning a home in a quiet, well-maintained neighborhood, the kind of place where children played safely on manicured lawns and neighbors exchanged polite nods while collecting their mail. He had worked hard for this moment. Years of study, late nights at the office, and countless sacrifices had finally culminated in the purchase of his dream home. The house itself was perfect. A spacious two-story colonial with a wraparound porch, a well-kept front yard, and a long, clean driveway that could fit multiple cars. It was nestled in a suburban community just outside the city, a place that promised peace, order, and a sense of belonging. As he stepped out of his car on the first day, inhaling the fresh suburban air, he felt an odd sense of accomplishment. He had made it. He belonged here. But there was also something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The silence of the neighborhood felt structured. The houses were immaculate, the streets pristine, the lawns trimmed to uniform perfection. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything had a place, and everything stayed in its place. Darius had barely started unpacking when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps on the driveway. He turned to see a middle-aged white woman striding towards him, a bright but calculating smile on her face. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored blazer, her blonde hair pinned back in a neat bun. She exuded an air of authority, the kind that was used to being respected, obeyed, and, most importantly, feared. "Welcome to the community," she announced with a crisp professional enthusiasm. "You must be Mr. Williams." Darius extended his hand politely. "That's me. And you are?" "Karen Stillman. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association. I'd like to personally welcome all our new residents. We take great pride in our community, and I'm sure you'll come to appreciate everything we do to maintain its character." Darius nodded, though there was something in the way she said character that didn't sit right with him. He had dealt with people like her before, polite on the surface but with an underlying sharpness that could cut when necessary. "That's great," he said, keeping his tone even. "I'm looking forward to settling in." Karen's eyes flicked to the car in the driveway, then to the boxes stacked near the porch. "I noticed you have quite a few vehicles. I trust they'll all fit in your garage." Darius arched an eyebrow. "I suppose so. But is that a problem?" "Oh, not at all," she said smoothly, her smile unwavering. "It's just that we have strict regulations about preserving the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. We like to keep things uniform. You'll find that we hold all our residents to the same high standard." Darius could tell this was not a casual observation. It was a warning. Later that evening, as he unpacked in his new home, he thought about their conversation. He had encountered this kind of subtle scrutiny before, the type that came wrapped in politeness but was meant to make you feel out of place. He reminded himself that he had earned his right to be here just like anyone else. The first few days passed without much incident, though he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He would catch glimpses of Karen strolling past his house more often than seemed necessary. She would always smile and wave, but there was an unmistakable sense of scrutiny in her eyes. Then the first letter arrived. It was an official notice from the HOA, neatly printed on expensive stationery. The subject, a violation of community guidelines. According to the letter, Darius's mailbox was not in compliance with the approved neighborhood standard. It stated that the mailbox was an unapproved color and did not conform to the harmonious aesthetic of the community. He was given 7 days to replace it or face fines. Darius read the letter twice, then walked outside to examine the mailbox. It was a standard black metal box, identical to several others on the street. He walked further down and noticed that his was the only one cited for noncompliance. A misunderstanding, he told himself. He decided to let it go for now, but the notices kept coming. A week later, he received another fine, this time for excessive brightness of the porch light. Another came for improper waste disposal, despite the fact that he had followed the exact schedule provided by the HOA. The most absurd one accused him of disrupting the uniformity of the street, because his lawn, though neatly trimmed, was a slightly different shade of green than his neighbor's. Darius wasn't stupid. This wasn't about rules. It was about something else. One evening, he struck up a conversation with an elderly black man who lived 2 houses down. Mr. Ellis had been in the neighborhood for decades, long before the HOA had become the iron-fisted entity it was now. "That woman's been running things for years," Ellis said in a low voice, glancing around as if checking for listening ears. "She keeps this place exactly the way she wants it, and if she doesn't want you here, she'll find a way to make you leave." Darius frowned. "How? Fines, harassment, legal loopholes. She'll push you until you can't take it anymore. And if that doesn't work, she's got her people in the city council, the police department, the real estate board. You ever notice how few black folks live here?" Darius had noticed. Now he knew why. Over the next few weeks, he started paying closer attention. He spoke to neighbors, looked up old records, and found a disturbing pattern. Nearly every black homeowner who had moved into the community in the last 10 years had sold their house within 2 years. Some had been sued over property disputes, others had been fined into financial strain, and many had simply given up under the constant pressure. It wasn't an accident. It was a system, and Darius had just become its next target. But unlike the others, he wasn't planning to leave. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. Darius sat in his home office, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating his face as he scrolled through pages of legal documents, HOA bylaws, and property laws for the county. He had spent years in the tech industry, solving complex problems through logic and patience, and now he was applying the same meticulous approach to understanding exactly what kind of game Karen and her HOA were playing. The more he read, the more disgusted he became. The bylaws were written in a way that gave the HOA an alarming amount of control over the personal lives of homeowners. They dictated everything from the number of plants one could have in their front yard to the types of vehicles that could be parked outside. None of these rules seemed particularly unusual at first glance. Most gated communities had similar regulations, but there was a pattern in how they were enforced. The language of the rules was deliberately vague, allowing the HOA board, meaning Karen, to apply them selectively. If she didn't like you, she could find something, anything, to cite as a violation. And if you fought back, she could bury you in legal fees, fines, and bureaucratic roadblocks until you had no choice but to sell and leave. That was what had happened to every black family that had moved in before him. He had looked up the previous homeowners of houses now occupied by white families. Almost every black homeowner in the last decade had left after a series of escalating fines, lawsuits, or sudden code violations that required expensive renovations. None of them had fought back for long. Darius wasn't going to be another statistic. If Karen wanted to play games, he would play too. But unlike the others, he wasn't going to fight on her terms. He wasn't going to argue, protest, or demand fairness. He had seen how that played out before. Good people standing up against systems rigged against them, only to be crushed under the weight of bureaucracy, legal fees, and exhaustion. No, he wasn't going to fight her head on. He was going to take away her power from the inside. The first step was understanding the HOA's structure. Karen wasn't acting alone. The board consisted of 5 members, but she had complete control over them. They were either her friends, people who benefited from her rule, or those too afraid to oppose her. That meant challenging her directly was useless. What he needed was control of the votes. Darius started researching property ownership in the neighborhood. That was when he found the first real crack in Karen's armor. The HOA only controlled about 40% of the properties in the neighborhood, meaning that if someone were to own a majority, they could outvote the board and rewrite the rules. That was his way in. The first step was property acquisition. He couldn't just start buying up houses in his name. That would be too obvious. Karen would see what he was doing and move to block him. Instead, he created a network of LLCs, each appearing independent but ultimately controlled by him. He hired a real estate agent from outside the neighborhood, someone without ties to the HOA, and began looking for homes that were up for sale. He didn't have to look far. Several homeowners were already struggling under Karen's reign, eager to leave. The fines, the constant surveillance, the unending pressure, it had all worn them down. Some were happy just to get out with a decent price for their home. Others didn't even realize the full extent of what was happening. They just knew something felt off and wanted to leave. He made his offers quietly, ensuring the sales went through without raising alarms. Within a few months, he owned 5 properties under different company names. It wasn't enough to take control yet, but it was a start. At the same time, he continued gathering evidence against Karen. He recorded every meeting, noting how she manipulated the board members, how she dismissed valid concerns, and how she tailored the rules to target specific residents. He even managed to get recordings of private conversations where she spoke more openly about her desire to keep the neighborhood's character intact, a phrase that barely disguised her real intentions. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how corrupt the entire system was. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules unfairly, she was profiting from it. Many of the contractors the HOA hired for mandatory repairs and maintenance were businesses she had personal stakes in. The fines homeowners paid didn't just go to the HOA, a percentage of them went into accounts tied to Karen and her close associates. It was a racket, one that had been running for years without challenge. As he gathered more evidence and acquired more properties, Karen began to take notice. She couldn't see what he was doing yet, but she sensed that something was wrong. The notices started arriving more frequently. Fines increased. She even tried sending inspectors to find safety violations in his home, but he had studied the codes too well. Everything was in perfect compliance. She couldn't find a real reason to escalate, so she made one up. One evening, he received an official letter stating that his cars violated the excess vehicle policy. The HOA had decided that no homeowner could have more than 2 vehicles parked in their driveway. It wasn't a real rule. He had checked the bylaws carefully. But Karen had held a private meeting with the board and had them voted into existence overnight. Darius knew this was an attempt to push him into a legal battle, one she thought he would eventually lose. Instead of fighting it directly, he used the opportunity to accelerate his plan. He approached other homeowners who were also tired of Karen's control, people who had been there for years and had seen what she was doing. Some were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation, but Darius was persuasive. He didn't ask them to fight. He asked them to sell. With every new property he acquired, he grew closer to the tipping point. Karen still had no idea what was happening. She saw him as just another troublesome homeowner, one she could eventually grind down like all the others. She had no idea that by the time she realized what was happening, it would be too late. Karen Stillman sat in her office, a small but tastefully decorated room inside her pristine colonial-style home, flipping through a stack of papers with growing frustration. Something was wrong. She could feel it. For years, she had run the HOA with the kind of authority that no one dared question. She had perfected the system, bending the rules in just the right ways, ensuring that every homeowner either conformed to her vision of the neighborhood or was pushed out. It had worked flawlessly for over a decade, but now something was changing. There was a disturbance in the order she had cultivated so carefully, and it all pointed back to one man, Darius Williams. She had tried everything: fines, new restrictions, even discreetly pressuring some of her allies on the board to take action. But nothing had shaken him. If anything, he had grown bolder. Despite the escalating penalties, the court summons, and the increased scrutiny, he wasn't backing down. Worse, she had started to notice houses changing hands in ways that felt odd. She was used to being aware of every home sale in the community, often influencing them to ensure the right kind of people moved in. But lately, properties had been selling quietly, and none of her usual channels had been involved. It was as if someone was working against her from the shadows, and the only logical culprit was Darius. Meanwhile, Darius was well aware of the storm brewing around him. He could feel Karen's scrutiny intensifying, but it didn't change his plan. He was moving faster now, acquiring more properties, gaining more influence, and gathering more evidence. But, most importantly, he was building alliances. He had spent the last few months identifying which residents were tired of Karen's rule but had been too afraid to speak out. It wasn't hard to find them. Many had suffered under her arbitrary fines and manipulative tactics. He approached them carefully, never revealing too much at once, but offering them something they had never considered before: an alternative. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation, but as he showed them the documents, the financial records he had uncovered, the sheer scale of corruption behind Karen's control, they began to see the truth. This wasn't about maintaining a beautiful neighborhood. It was about power, control, and money. One by one, they started selling to him, trusting him with the future of their homes. Then came the lawsuit. Karen had finally escalated to her last resort, legal action. She had convinced the HOA board to file a civil suit against him, citing violation of community standards and repeated refusal to comply with HOA directives. It was a bold move, one that she had used before to drain homeowners of their willpower and financial resources. Most people settled or left before it could even go to trial. But Darius was prepared. He hired a top-tier real estate attorney, someone with experience dismantling HOAs that overstepped their bounds. When the case was formally brought before the court, Karen was expecting Darius to plead for leniency, maybe negotiate a quiet exit in exchange for dropping the suit. Instead, he countersued. Not only did he challenge the fines, but he also presented the evidence he had gathered: proof of discriminatory enforcement, financial fraud, and conflicts of interest within the HOA's leadership. He filed motions demanding a full audit of the HOA's financials, subpoenaed Karen's personal records, and forced a discovery process that sent shockwaves through the community. Karen had underestimated him. She had assumed he would break under pressure like all the others. Instead, she found herself on the defensive for the first time in years. The lawsuit was only the beginning. Public opinion in the neighborhood started to shift. People who had once been loyal to Karen began questioning her authority. The cracks in her power were widening, and Darius was prepared to widen them further. At the next HOA meeting, he made his move. With a calm and measured voice, he outlined the evidence he had gathered. Documents proving that Karen had been funneling HOA funds into her personal accounts, directing maintenance contracts to companies she had financial stakes in, and weaponizing the HOA's bylaws to target specific homeowners. Some residents gasped. Others remained silent, their expressions unreadable. But the most important reaction came from the board members themselves. For the first time, Darius saw doubt in their faces. Karen tried to regain control, launching into a tirade about outsiders trying to dismantle the community, about how she had dedicated years to preserving the integrity of the neighborhood. But the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded. Darius didn't need to argue. The facts spoke for themselves. By the end of the night, 2 board members quietly stepped down, unwilling to be dragged down with her. That was all he needed. With their departure, a vote was triggered to elect replacements. And, for the first time in years, Karen wasn't the one choosing them. The air in the meeting hall was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against the walls and lingered in every breath taken. Karen Stillman sat at the head of the long wooden table, her fingers clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had spent years maintaining absolute control over this community, shaping it into her vision of perfection, dictating who belonged and who did not. And yet, here she was, facing a room that no longer hung on her every word. Darius sat across from her, calm, his expression unreadable. He had waited for this moment, and he knew that everything he had done up to now had led to this night. The slow acquisition of properties, the gathering of allies, the exposure of corruption, all of it had built towards this inevitable confrontation. Karen was beginning to realize just how much ground she had lost, but she wasn't the kind of person to surrender easily. The remaining board members were uneasy, shifting in their seats as they glanced at one another. 2 of them had already resigned after the last meeting, their silence an admission of guilt, or at least an acknowledgement of the storm that was coming. That left 3, and they were looking at Karen now, waiting for her to guide them through this crisis. But she had no script for this. She was used to controlling every piece of the board, every vote, every conversation. Now, for the first time, there was uncertainty. Darius leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I think we all understand why we're here tonight," he said, his voice steady. "This community has functioned under one leadership for a long time. But tonight, we're at a crossroads. We can choose to continue with business as usual, or we can acknowledge the truth about what's been happening here and move forward in a new direction." Karen let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Truth?" she repeated. "Is that what you think you've uncovered? You've done nothing but twist the facts, manipulate people into thinking there's some grand conspiracy here. But the truth is simple. I've done what was necessary to protect the integrity of this neighborhood." Darius didn't flinch. "And by integrity, you mean control. Selective enforcement of fines, steering homeowners toward selling when it suits your vision, pocketing HOA funds under the table. "Do I need to go on?" Murmurs rippled through the audience. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak out were here tonight, watching, listening. Some had been victims of Karen's tactics themselves, fined for minor infractions that others got away with, pressured to conform or sell. They had never thought they could fight back. Until now. Karen straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing. "You act like you're some kind of savior, but you don't belong here, Mr. Williams. You never did. You came in with your expensive cars and your arrogance, thinking you could change the way things work. But this isn't just about you. It's about all of us." Darius let a small silence stretch between them before he spoke again. "You're right. This isn't about me. It's about everyone in this room. The people who have lived here for years and watched as their friends and neighbors were pushed out. The people who have been fined into submission. The ones who never felt truly welcome in a neighborhood they paid just as much to live in as anyone else." He reached into the folder in front of him and pulled out a stack of documents. "I've spent months gathering evidence, financial records, emails, even audio recordings of conversations that I'm sure you don't want played out loud tonight. This isn't about perception anymore, Karen. It's about facts. And the fact is, the homeowners in this community deserve a fair HOA, one that serves them, not the interests of a select few." A heavy silence fell over the room. One of the board members, a man in his 60s who had always been one of Karen's closest allies, cleared his throat. "What exactly are you proposing?" Darius kept his gaze steady. "A vote. Effective immediately, the homeowners present tonight should have the right to decide if this board and its leadership should continue as it is, or if we should hold new elections. A clean slate." Karen's face twisted in fury. "You don't have the authority to call a vote." Darius met her glare head-on. "Actually, I do. As of last week, I own enough properties in this community to constitute a majority stake in the HOA voting rights. And, per the HOA bylaws, ones you helped put in place, by the way, a homeowner holding a majority can call for a vote of no confidence against the current board." The silence that followed was absolute. Karen looked at the remaining board members, her face betraying the first hints of real panic. They were supposed to back her, to stand by her as they always had, but one by one they avoided her gaze. They knew she was finished. The vote was held. It wasn't even close. By the end of the night, Karen Stillman was no longer the president of the HOA. The board was dissolved, pending new elections. Homeowners who had once felt powerless had, for the first time, taken back control of their own community. Karen sat there for a long time after the vote was counted, as if refusing to accept the reality of what had just happened. When she finally stood, her expression was blank, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't say a word as she gathered her papers, as if she could will herself into believing that none of this had happened. Then, without a glance at anyone, she turned and walked out of the meeting hall. No one stopped her. Darius remained seated, letting the victory settle in, but he knew it wasn't over. There was still work to be done. The HOA needed to be rebuilt, not just torn down. The neighborhood needed to heal from years of control and quiet oppression. And Karen, she wouldn't go down without trying to take someone with her. But for the first time, he wasn't alone in the fight. For the first time, the people of this community had seen what it meant to stand up. And there was no going back. Darius woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen, and stood by his window looking out over the quiet neighborhood. The streets were still, the houses lined in perfect symmetry, just as they had always been. But something had changed. There was an energy in the air, a subtle shift in the balance of power that could not be seen, only felt. For the first time since moving here, he could breathe. Karen was gone. Or, at least, she had lost. The vote the night before had stripped her of the power she had wielded for so many years, her empire of control collapsing in a single evening. The board had been dissolved. New elections were on the horizon, and the homeowners, the real homeowners, not just those she had deemed acceptable, had reclaimed what was rightfully theirs. It was a victory, but Darius knew better than to celebrate too soon. He had seen it in her eyes as she left the meeting hall, the quiet, burning fury of a woman who was not used to losing. She hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened, or made a dramatic exit. She had simply stood, gathered her things, and walked out. And that was what unsettled him the most. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. If she had gone down quietly, it meant she was already planning her next move. By noon, the rumors had started. Word spread through the neighborhood that Karen was threatening legal action, claiming that the vote had been illegitimate, that Darius had used shady tactics to gain control of the HOA, that the new leadership was politically motivated. Some of her longtime supporters, though fewer in number now, were still clinging to the idea that she had been wronged. They muttered among themselves, whispering conspiracies about how Darius had somehow tricked them all, about how he was going to change everything and ruin the community. Darius ignored it. He had expected this. Instead, he focused on rebuilding. The first priority was addressing the damage Karen had done, both financially and structurally. The HOA's financial records, once kept under lock and key, were now being reviewed in full, and as expected, the corruption ran deep. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled into administrative costs that had no clear purpose. Funds meant for neighborhood maintenance had been funneled into private contracts with companies linked to Karen's closest associates. Even the fines homeowners had been forced to pay had, in many cases, never actually gone toward community improvements, but had instead disappeared into untraceable accounts. It was theft, plain and simple. There were discussions about legal action, about pressing charges against Karen and the board members who had aided her. But the reality was more complicated. She had covered her tracks well, and even with the evidence they had, a drawn-out legal battle could take years, with no guarantee of justice. Instead, the focus had to be on fixing what had been broken. One by one, the old policies were dismantled. The ridiculous fines for aesthetic violations were eliminated. The aggressive surveillance of homeowners, something Karen had once defended as preserving neighborhood standards, was shut down completely. The board, when re-elected, would operate transparently, with decisions made in public meetings, not behind closed doors. And, most importantly, those who had been unfairly targeted over the years were acknowledged. Homeowners who had been fined into financial hardship saw their penalties overturned. Those who had been forced to pay excessive HOA fees received refunds. It wasn't a perfect solution. Some damage could never be undone, but it was a step toward making things right. Still, there was resistance. Not everyone in the neighborhood welcomed the changes. Some genuinely believed Karen had been right to enforce such strict standards. They saw Darius not as a liberator, but as an outsider who had come in and upended tradition. These were the people who had lived comfortably under her rule, who had benefited from her selective enforcement, who had never been fined, never been harassed, never been told they didn't belong. They resented the new order. Darius was not surprised when, a week later, he received his first direct message from Karen herself. It arrived in the form of a letter delivered by hand, neatly folded inside an unmarked envelope. There was no anger in the words she had written, no threats or accusations. It was polite, even professional. Mr. Williams, I suppose congratulations are in order. You've won. 4 now. I won't insult you by pretending that I accept this outcome, nor will I pretend that I believe you belong here. But you and I both know that power is not taken so easily without consequence. You think you've ended something, but what you've done is started a war you're not prepared to fight. You believe the people are on your side now, but people are fickle, and loyalty fades. I built this community. I shaped it into what it is. And you think you can tear that down in a single night? We'll see. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. There was no signature. Darius read it twice, then calmly folded it and placed it on his desk. He wasn't afraid. He had known from the beginning that this wouldn't end cleanly. Karen had lost, but she still had influence. She still had allies, and she would do everything in her power to undermine him, to turn the neighborhood against him to regain what she had lost. That was fine. He hadn't come here to play by her rules. By the time evening fell, he had already received a call from another community, one not too far from his own, where a different HOA president had been using the same tactics Karen had. They had heard about what he had done, and they wanted his help. Darius smiled to himself as he leaned back in his chair. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Darius sat in his home office, the dim glow of his laptop screen illuminating the stacks of documents spread across his desk. It had been weeks since the vote, weeks since Karen had been stripped of her power, but he knew better than to assume the fight was over. The kind of control she had wielded for so long didn't just disappear overnight. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike back. The letter she had sent him still sat on his desk, a reminder that she wasn't done. He had expected retaliation, but so far she had remained quiet. Too quiet. Then the first cracks appeared. A few homeowners, ones who had remained loyal to Karen, began spreading rumors. They whispered about how the new HOA leadership was too relaxed, that without Karen's strict enforcement, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. They claimed property values were already beginning to drop, though there was no evidence of that. Some of them even tried to rally support for a petition to overturn the election results. Darius had anticipated this. Change was uncomfortable, especially for those who had benefited from the old system. He didn't respond publicly, didn't waste energy on their paranoia. Instead, he focused on action. The new HOA held its first public meeting, something that had never happened under Karen's rule. Every homeowner was invited, and for the first time decisions were made transparently. Budgets were laid out, expenses explained, and homeowners had a real say in the direction of their own community. The changes weren't drastic, just fair. No more arbitrary fines. No more selective enforcement. No more hidden fees. And yet, Karen wasn't done. One morning, an official notice arrived at Darius's doorstep. A lawsuit. She was challenging the legitimacy of the election, claiming that Darius had illegally manipulated the system to take over the HOA. The case was thin, built on nothing but speculation and the complaints of a handful of her most loyal followers, but it was enough to be a nuisance. Darius didn't flinch. He had been preparing for this. His legal team dismantled the lawsuit before it could even reach trial. The financial audit of the HOA, one Karen had fought so hard to keep hidden, was now fully exposed. The records proved beyond a doubt that she had embezzled funds, falsified meeting notes, and used her position for personal gain. If she wanted to take this to court, she would only be digging her own grave. Before the case could proceed, Karen withdrew the lawsuit. She knew she had lost. A week later, a move-in truck appeared in front of Karen's house. Darius watched from his front porch as workers loaded furniture, boxes, and the remnants of her carefully curated life into the truck. She stood on the driveway, directing them with clipped, precise movements. When she finally turned to glance at the street, her eyes locked onto his. For the first time since they had met, there was no smug confidence in her expression, no quiet superiority, only anger, tightly controlled and beneath it, something that almost looked like fear. She held his gaze for a long moment before turning away. Moments later, she got into her car and drove off. It was over. The neighborhood wouldn't change overnight. There would always be those who resisted, who longed for the rigid control Karen had provided, but that control was gone, and in its place something better had begun to grow. Darius took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Then his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a voice on the other end hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Williams? I heard about what you did with your HOA. We need help. Our neighborhood is dealing with something similar. We don't know what to do." Darius closed his eyes and smiled. The fight wasn't over, and that was just fine with him. Subscribe for more stories like this, and don't forget to check out other videos on the channel. Share this video with others and stay tuned for what's next.